Good evening, I'm Casey Nolan. 50 years ago, we were in the middle of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. We had the March on Washington here locally, protest at Jefferson Bank. But tonight on Stay Tuned, we are not just marking anniversaries, but we are measuring how far we have come and how far we still have to go when it comes to race in St. Louis. So stay tuned. Okay, we're starting tonight's show with a look back. As you may see from time to time, some historical footage in the monitors, and we always turn to the 9 Network's Jim Kircher to put history in perspective for us. I mentioned Jefferson Bank protest just a second ago. A lot of people may not be particularly familiar with this story. We're going to hear more about that in a second, but why, can you tell us why Jefferson Bank saw protests?
Yeah, and you have to remember that a lot of these times, these events almost seem 50 years later like they existed in a vacuum. There were things going on all over the city before that, after that, during that. Jefferson Bank just seemed to pull together a number of factors that made it the event that gives it the name Jefferson Bank. There were other businesses being targeted at the time, before, again, during, and after. And so a lot of the footage we're going to see, we had run during our Decades series at the end of the 20th century, because when you cover the history of St. Louis in the 20th century, you can't leave out Jefferson Bank. And I think the question tonight really is not just what happened, but I think the interesting thing to note is what people accepted as the norm 50 years ago. And then I think the question for us tonight and from here on out is, what do we maybe accept as the norm in terms of injustice that maybe we're not addressing in a way that we need to address?
We're going to see your piece. You have an excellent interview live lined up afterwards, but first, let's take a look back with Jim Kircher.
It's how things were 50 years ago. Businesses might hire a few blacks for menial backroom jobs, but outside of black neighborhoods, you wouldn't see them sitting at a desk or out front dealing with customers. There were commissions and talks and some progress, but a lot of people felt things just weren't going far enough, fast enough. And despite disagreements among activists over tactics, it was clear in 1963 that it could no longer be business as usual. Not in St. Louis, not in America. In August of that year, there was the March on Washington. But a lot of St. Louis's civil rights activists missed Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. They had stayed home to make their own history at Jefferson Bank, a protest organized by CORE, the Committee of Racial Equality.
It was the first time that we had had a major confrontation between the power structure, the in-group, the business community, and just the average African American.
Norman Seay was one of the CORE leaders and a veteran of the local civil rights movement. For years, there had been marches and lunch counter sit-ins in St. Louis, and the city passed a public accommodations law in 1961. But now the battle was over jobs. There were signs that civil disobedience was becoming somewhat less civil and more disobedient. Jefferson Bank officials knew that and had gotten a court order prohibiting demonstrators from interfering with bank business. And for a time, they did just march outside. But then at some point, some protesters went into the bank and others followed.
And we ask you, as officers and employees of this bank, to please leave our premises forthwith.
It was not planned to be more disruptive. It evolved into that.
What happened that day may not have been planned, but it wasn't unprecedented. Just a few weeks before, there had been a series of sit-ins at businesses in East St. Louis. The biggest one was at First National Bank. Protesters were arrested and carried out by police, but very quickly, a deal was cut. The bank agreed to hire on some black workers, and the city agreed to drop the charges. One of the core leaders told me years ago that some of the East St. Louis protesters came here to what was then Jefferson Bank. And while he and other core leaders were talking about what their next move might be, it was the veterans of the East St. Louis sit-ins who went into the bank. There may be other versions of exactly how it started, but what's more important is what happened next. Because in St. Louis there was no deal made, the judge ordered the core leaders arrested for violating the injunction, and that's what stoked the fire, getting others involved, including the late civil rights activist and attorney Margaret Bush Wilson.
That case mobilized all of us. That first day in Judge Michael Scott's courtroom, the walls were lined with black lawyers.
There were more demonstrations outside City Jail in support of the defendants, including Norman Say and City Alderman and future Congressman William Clay. And for months, protesters continued their pickets outside the bank until they began to see real change.
The demonstrations ended because the banking industry and other companies began employing African Americans. In fact, while we were in jail, companies were going out to the Urban League, the NAACP, to various social organizations, political organizations, and employing African Americans. And so that's how it ended.
Early the following year, Mayor Tucker's Employment Commission announced that since the previous summer, local banks had hired 84 Negroes into office, clerical, and training positions. And throughout the city, more than 1,000 blacks had been hired or put in training programs by all kinds of companies. 13 of them had never, ever before hired a black employee. For Stay Tuned, I'm Jim Kircher. And joining me is civil rights activist Percy Green, a veteran, really, of the movement from, I guess, the 1950s, and probably still, right? I hate to say it, but you've been around a while. Okay, we'll say the 1960s. You were involved in CORE, Committee on Racial Equality, originally. Not at that initial demonstration, but at some of the demonstrations that continued and followed. I'm just wondering, 50 years later, you know, we sometimes say, well, who cares? It's a nice thing to commemorate and nice things to note. What should we remember, or maybe what have we forgotten that we need to remember about what was going on then?
Well, we must remember that there was always a profit in racism, and it still is. Now, the point now is to what degree is the profit is still there in practicing racism and racial discrimination.
One of the things that I've always seen Jefferson Bank and others as well is sort of a turning point and a tipping point. Before that, there had been negotiations, compromises. I always said St. Louis was not a place that said give them an inch and they'll take a mile. Give them a couple of inches and they'll be happy for a while. Blacks had the vote. They had some political power. So we're not talking about George Wallace and Bull Connor in St. Louis. Why do you think, because you were one of these people who took that confrontational approach to civil rights, why do you think that was necessary in St. Louis?
Well, again, because we had to make racism a liability rather than an asset. And the way to do that is to make as many people as possible aware of the nature of racial discrimination. And I'm a strong believer in civil disobedience. I think that's when you can get the attention of those that are responsible, and at the same time you can wake up or make the community aware of the problem.
Some people said then, and they probably still say now, that those kinds of tactics, especially the kind that you used, we'll talk about that a little bit with action, set things back, that people have been working really hard to make these gradual improvements, and that this approach set all of that back. You must have heard that.
Well, I've heard that a million times, but you hear that from those from that element that want to mislead the community. But the facts of the matter is that usually businesses get busy and start doing pretty much the right thing when there is some form of confrontation, some form. Now keep in mind now, when you, let's understand that we're talking about civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is a nonviolent form of confrontation.
Now you were, I read somewhere, arrested maybe 100 times?
Yeah, thereabout, yes.
Right, right. And famously, I think there's a number of things, and I want to talk about things that you're very well known for, but I want to talk about why you were doing that. You climbed the arch in
Yes.
1964.
That's right.
Stayed up there for, what, 3 hours?
No, about 5 hours.
5 hours. Famously blocked, I think, the Veiled Prophet parade, helped unmask the Veiled Prophet at the ball. Some things that are considered outrageous tactics.
Well, it was colorful. I mean,
Right.
some
Did it get
people
news
may-
coverage?
Huh?
It got news coverage.
Well, I mean, sure. I mean, anytime you engage, especially people in struggle, and especially black folks, I mean, if there's an element of breaking the laws, I mean, the white news media they see a great deal of newsworthiness in that. You know.
But I want to go back because as I look at some of those issues, not just your tactics, but the issue for the Arch was hiring minority workers in federally funded projects, hiring minority workers in McDonnell Douglas where they're building
Yeah,
fighter
and
planes.
contracts,
with
and
Right.
contracts.
So
And-
these are all issues that are still with us today. But I
Yes.
wanted to end with one thing, not just the tactics for which you're remembered, but there's a court case that you were involved in, Green versus McDonnell Douglas,
Yes.
which ended up with a Supreme Court decision that made it, I'll say, somewhat easier for someone like yourself to prove through overwhelming circumstantial evidence that there was discrimination in a job.
That is
It
correct.
wasn't a test case, it was your personal case. But is that really your legacy? Because that's in the law books and that's still the basis of a lot of discrimination suits.
Well, I don't know whether it would be fair to say that would be my legacy because I'm still active.
Right.
You know, so
Are you still
I mean,
angry?
I'm still angry.
Yeah.
You know, because the progress that has been made is only a broader form of tokenism. So we still have not got it right, and so consequently, until it's gotten right, then I'm going to be active.
Right. This, as they say, is
And
steady
going to
word
be
for you.
disruptive. See, the nature. I mean, what has to be emphasized is that the nature of the protest movement has to be disruptive. We have to disrupt the status quo. Otherwise, the status quo won't pay attention to what is being brought before them.
Great. Percy Green, thanks for joining us. And I know we're going to get some comments on social media. Ed Reggie is following the tweets tonight. Ed?
Thanks, Jim. Well, I'm actually the one that's listening tonight throughout the entire broadcast what you're saying. And in fact, in the last couple of weeks, we put this out there. We asked the community on social media, what is race and where we've come in the last 50 years in St. Louis? And we've been hearing from you throughout the last few weeks and tonight. In fact, we've been hearing things like being careful of talking about race versus racism. And one tweet from STL Rocks said there's still work to be done. And that's what we're doing tonight. So there's two ways you can join in the conversation. One way is to log on to our Facebook page. We put a question there earlier this afternoon. Go on there on the 9 Network page and comment on that. Give us your feedback. Or you can actually use Twitter by using the hashtag StayTunedSTL. Let's see what you're already saying.
Well, we're going to try to answer some of those questions that Ed just brought up that you have on Twitter. And to help us do that, we're going to have our first table here. Let me do some introductions here first, starting with Veta Thompson from Washington University, leading researcher in race and diversity. Also with us is Thomas Harvey, Arch City Defenders, providing legal services to people who are marginalized in our community largely. And Kira Hudson Banks, thanks for coming back to the show, St. Louis University Assistant Professor of Psychology. Also, you work in workplace diversity and other issues around tonight's topic. But before we get started here, we talked about looking back. We're also going to look forward tonight. Let's start this conversation off with some perspectives from some young St. Louisans.
So to me, like, race is just, I guess, how people perceive you, like, on like face value, like this is the race that you are.
When your race, you walk into your job, okay? They're gonna look at you in a certain way. They're gonna look at your race. I may come in there and say I'm yellow, but they're gonna look at me and say you're African American, you're black, so you're gonna be treated this way.
I'm originally from Mexico, so I see it a little different. To me, race is just a classification that separates the differences of physical looks.
In our generation, we're just coming out of an era where people didn't talk about anything. They talking about things like race and sexuality it was not okay to talk about that. And so I feel like we're still kind of, we're being raised by that generation.
Now, we don't have to go out and march and kill people and things like that. It's not what we need. What we do need is just to be more sensitive about the fact that, like, we have other different people here in America.
And there will always be people that say that racism does not exist, but it's because we don't talk about it. It's something that's not talked about.
For about as long as we've been on the air with Stay Tuned, this has been a topic that you have wanted us to tackle. A lot of times people say this is a hard thing to talk about. Is this a hard conversation? Why is this so difficult to talk about, or is it not?
I think race is hard to talk about because we have a history of racism in our society. So we have a history of treating people differently based on their race, whether it's citizenship or housing, and there are so many ways in which we've treated people differently. And so we don't like to talk about that legacy. It's uncomfortable when we see it happening all around us.
I think the other reason it can be very difficult is because if we have a serious conversation and we admit the extent to which our institutions and social and legal structures have been influenced by this, and we admit that these things need to change, it means that the balance of power and privilege would also have to change. And I'm not sure everyone is committed to that at this point. That's an uncomfortable position to be in, to even think about that maybe, just maybe, where I am is not solely predicated on everything that I've done and I've accomplished. Those are hard things to wrestle with.
But you know what's interesting? If we think about other models of other countries, Germany, right, with Nazi Germany, they've actually made a commitment as a country to never forget. And so they talk about their history of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust so that it stays alive in people's minds to not let it happen, whereas we don't like to talk about our history.
What's even more interesting is that we probably have as much to wrestle with as Germany does, because we had a eugenics movement that was quite strong at the time that World War II broke out. As soon as we entered, we erased that from the national consciousness. You do not hear Americans talking about the eugenics movement that took place, where based on race, based on sexual orientation, based on any number of factors, we were doing many of the things that Germany was talking about. So we've got a lot to wrestle with.
Yeah, and that's the place where the young lady that was talking about race being a classification system, she's right, and we have a history of doing that in our country, right? But it's not just the classification system. It has to do with access and power and privilege, and I think it's really important to realize that race, we've constructed it. It's a social construct, and it's bogus in the sense that we actually have more difference within race than across race.
From the biological standpoint.
So what is the definition? We heard on the tweet there, but don't mix up race and racism. How do you define race for tonight's conversation?
Race is, for the way that I typically will explain it, race is a term, a construct borrowed from biology. From that standpoint, we have no evidence that race exists as a classification system for human beings. But race is a social construct. We have used it as a major organizing principle, deciding who is positioned where in our society for over a century now. And so as a social reality, it does exist, and we have to deal with it that way.
And one of the ways it comes into play, I think it's most interesting, it was sort of highlighted in the clip, is institutional racism versus individual racism. There's some studies that suggest that younger folks view racism in two different ways depending on where they fit in the spectrum. Young people of color view racism as an institutional issue. And they see that reflected in the courts and with the police and the schools and healthcare and throughout a broad spectrum of their life. Younger people who are in the majority see it as an individual action, and it's kind of a colloquialism, but we're past the point where the Ku Klux Klan is burning crosses on the lawn. That's not our only indicator that there's racism that exists in America. We're at a place where it's become ingrained in the fabric of our institutions to where it's almost invisible without a further sort of investigation of those institutions.
We have the laws that were passed in the 1960s. Where is our institutional racism now?
I was really intrigued by that piece, because I think if you look at we talked about this a little bit before the show, the idea of like looking back and showing where we started and then trying to measure where we are today. If you think about race in America, it goes back, it's ingrained in our Constitution. It's there from the very founding documents of our country. And then we have this steady, that continues through roughly the mid-50s, 1960s, where we have this one moment in our entire history where we say, that's wrong, we should do this, we should do something about this. And from that moment forward, if you go to the 1980s, there's sort of a slow but steady and continuing rolling back of those protections. Even the racial discrimination side, the laws that Mr. Green was talking about, that he's part of that case, Jim mentioned it, it must be an overwhelming anecdotal evidence of discrimination. That's just been harder and harder and harder to prove. So we had this one moment in time where the laws were strong, and then they've kind of declined.
And I think you see it unfortunately, in our criminal justice system, in our education system, in terms of even our healthcare system. There have been studies around the field of medicine in terms of who gets the most pain medication, in terms of people believing that they're actually in pain, or who gets the most comprehensive scans in terms of the healthcare. And it's not, I would really like to say, it's not about finding who the bad apples are and who is racist. It's more about seeing what are the norms and how are our institutions set up that kind of guide us to treating different groups of people differently.
And it's really about how we understand what racism, what discrimination is. We have this view that it is the Klan marching and burning things and people bombing houses. But it is more than that. It is when you show favoritism to the in group and you are overly critical of the out group, and there is a great deal of that. So if you look at policing, if a young African American male is there and he's walking late at night, he must be a criminal, must be committing a crime, watch him. If it's a young white male, oh, do you need any help? Are you lost? Did your car break down? I mean, it's a very different attitude, and that bias is ingrained. We have made status of being African or Latino or something bad, and white is synonymous with good, and we act that out in many ways.
Thank you all. This is a great start to the tonight's conversation. We appreciate it. Let's go back to social media.
Of crazy stuff, and they look at a lot of crazy stuff on TV. The news will feed you so much garbage to make you so scared.
The entire school system thing is something that I've been really passionate about, and I think the idea of that a lot of individuals are allowing their kind of stereotypes of Black students, of areas, to kind of take over the fact that these are all students who are trying to attain the same education as your child.
I grew up in inner city schools, so I kind of know, I've had to walk through metal detectors, but it was no big deal.
Your idea of safety is something that's fearful to them. So it's you have to recognize that there's so much difference in the way that a group of people look at society. In reality, it happens almost every day to all of us. What I've kind of learned to do is, accept it and then if I had the chance, maybe talk to them about it.
Because I am white, I have no idea what it feels like. And I think most white people don't realize how absolutely socially privileged they are.
Like, it's just really interesting these days, like, that the media is, like, making it so cool to be black,
right.
Until the cops come, I guess.
Well, I was going to say, that sometimes it's all you see is black people getting arrested on the news.
My experiences were a little bit different than your guys'. Like, I was immersed in whiteness for my entire life. Like I said, I lived in Wildwood, Missouri. When I was younger, a news station did a special on my family, and because we were the only black family within a 10-mile radius.
I'm not sure what to think about that last comment, but I can tell you it did not. The station did not start with a K or end with a K in the call letters there. So I don't know who put that story together, but it wasn't 5. Anyway, let's jump right off from there and talk about race in the media with our next table. Let me do our introductions. Welcome back to the show, Doug Moore from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, covering diversity and culture for the paper. Also with us, Aaron Williams from St. Louis Public Radio, a producer for NPR just across the driveway here. We appreciate you being here. And Michael Murray, University of Missouri St. Louis, journalism professor. I tell you what, let me throw some terms and some names out there when we're talking about race in the media. We have, of course, Mr. Martin, Trayvon Martin. We have some stuff going on in Arkansas with a young man who was shot locally. We have school transfers. We have a lot of things that seem to have race involved in them. Also, the Missouri State Fair, we can't forget about here recently. Are we wrong to read race into these issues, or is that what's going on?
I feel that the media tries to remain as objective as possible. We focus on what is news and what is happening and what is going on. And from that, the response of what the public gives is how things continue to happen.
I think a lot of these stories, they're recurring in a sense. I can remember as an undergraduate student here at St. Louis University doing a program about black guys on campus who were being kind of hassled by the campus police. And this is like 30, 40 years ago. And the issue only came to mind because one of my friends, his older brother was president of the Association of Black Collegians, and he sort of told me that this was going on. And I got some compliments from my professors about how we did it and just talking about it. But, when you mentioned Trayvon Martin, I thought, the way I've thought about this is it's kind of been a recurring issue. It's sort of the same issue. It's an identity issue to a great extent. And I think it's more complicated today because black broadcasters, for example, we were just talking about this, so many of them have become so prominent, like Gwen Ifill, and we were talking about Byron Pitts. And I've had a chance to interview some of these people over the years, and frequently they don't identify as much as a black reporter as much as they do just trying to be a good reporter. So it makes it in some ways a little bit more complicated to attack the problem today, but I think talking about it does a lot.
I think that we can't push race to the side, though. I think with the school transfer issue particularly, I mean, it doesn't take long for you, if you're watching TV at night, to see that the kids getting off of those buses are primarily black, going to schools that are primarily white. And the schools that are failing are schools where they're mainly black kids. And we saw the picture in the Post-Dispatch of the mother standing up at a meeting, a white mom, saying that we can't have this. We moved away from this. We're going to have to put these metal detectors in our schools. And
that woman I know has defended herself, saying it wasn't about race. But go ahead.
But how can it not be? I mean, how can we not have that conversation? Because those are the kids that are going to come in, and that's, if you're saying we need metal detectors, why? Because we're bringing black kids into the school? I mean, in this case, Riverview Gardens and Normandy equals black students. So it is about race, and you just have to put it out there.
Let's broaden this out a little bit, just beyond our local news media or national news media. Talk about other types of media. We heard some comments there from the young folks. How does that play into our perceptions of race when we look at what we are seeing and hearing culturally?
Well, I think the good news as far as today is that a lot of times the media outlets are kind of reconsidering what they're doing, are reviewing what they do, or what they used to call a second day story, where they'll do a follow-up. So in the last few days, for example, there was a big shootout down here, and I know your station, your other station, Channel 5, went back and interviewed some of the people involved and said, number one, these people who were involved in that weren't from this area. Number two, it's very safe. Then the it was a woman, alderman, talked about how this was portrayed initially at the station. So I think the benefit of talking about it is you get people thinking more about what are the key issues and how can we expand our views about what's actually going on. So to be able to talk about the situation with the school districts, I think we've come a long way. It used to be, it was just sort of out there and you had to digest it on your own. Now we've got these opportunities to kind of revisit how things have been presented. So I think that's a plus.
That is a plus, revisiting and continuing to bring in additional voices that aren't just black or aren't just white. There are more than two races that live in the city, and there are more than two races that are affected by what is going on. And like you said, going back and having continuing stories and furthering the narrative helps us to continue to learn more about it.
I know in Melville, when we talked about the diversity issues in the transfer story, he was the superintendent, Dr. Eric Kanosh, was quick to point out that he has students speaking 50 different languages when they go home. So there is a lot more than just a black and white issue, as you were talking about. Right. Can we get any historical perspective quickly? We just have about 30 seconds. When we look back at the footage Jim was showing, were things covered differently for the Jefferson Break protest?
Things were covered differently in the sense that the media, mostly the network news operations, started to target civil rights as soon as it became a federal issue. So I think that's largely misunderstood. That people think that, the St. Louis media wasn't covering the story. It may be true that they weren't, but that was pretty typical. Unless the story was really ugly, as it became, in the Deep South, and unless the federal government stepped in, it mostly wasn't covered. But I've talked to people who were involved in that, and they said that's one of the real downsides of our current era is people don't remember how ugly a story that was, and that isn't really taught very well.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to get to a piece earlier this week. We had a chance to talk to Ray Suarez from the NewsHour, who gave us his perspective on the very topic we're talking about right now. We're joined by Ray Suarez from Washington, D.C. Ray obviously is the senior correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. And Ray, thanks for being here. We appreciate your time. You have covered the topic we are talking about tonight, and you've also written about the topic, your book, The Old Neighborhood. I want to jump in with something you wrote about in here. Tell us, how do you see race playing a role in how our cities have developed, where we live?
Before the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Acts of 1965, before the Fair Housing Laws, race was a powerful, powerful sorter of human beings. Yes, you can live west of this street. No, you have to live south of that street, depending on your race. And in the decades that followed, money started to be more of a powerful sorter than race. I mean, race was still in there.
We've all heard the term white flight, but you talk about something, black flight. What is that? What does that mean, and why does that occur?
Middle class, white collar black families that had been able to move ahead in their professions, make a little bit more money, found that their mobility was stifled in a lot of cases. They couldn't move wherever their money would take them. So black flight began when that first mobile group started to leave the ghetto. At the same time, commercial interests from outside those traditionally black neighborhoods started to move in. So black grocery stores disappeared. Black insurance companies disappeared. National chains began to buy black funeral homes. National grocers started to move into the places where black food sellers had done their business.
On both sides of that time, was there a lot of fear? Was it fearful for people to see this on their television screens?
There was plenty of fear to go around, and some of it was well placed. I mean, there was a lot of violence that accompanied what ended up being a fairly wrenching social change. 100 years of post-Civil War custom and brutality and the use of money to deny people their rights had created a widely distributed worry about everything that was going to accompany the changes that were being promised by the 1960s. People had a sense that this was not going to be a cost-free proposition. I think I may be a little older than you, but I remember turning on the TV as a kid and seeing those water cannon and seeing those dogs and seeing blocks on fire and thinking, the world is flying to pieces. That growing up in a country like this wasn't necessarily going to be such a great proposition, especially when you're one of the people that other people are moving away from.
Just wanted to get your thoughts on education and race from your reporting. How do you see that playing out? Because it's not just our neighborhoods.
Suburbs have, for a long time, been able to take advantage of the presumption of the excellence of their schools. So even if people don't take the time to look at the standardized test scores of one particular district or another, if you just have them stand on the curb at 3:15 and watch kids pouring out the door, they will have an impression already of which school is quote-unquote a good school and which school is quote-unquote a bad school based on who the kids are.
What role did our press, did our media play in the 60s, and what's the role now?
Most big city newsrooms were in the center city. They were near the civic center of any big marketplace. So out of laziness and out of geography, urban crime got covered more heavily than suburban crime.
Are we repeating any of our history with other racial minorities?
Now immigrants are very heavily starting their lives in suburban areas, in part because that's where the jobs are. So we're creating a new model for assimilation and acculturation. Also, a new economic class is moving into center cities, reclaiming neighborhoods that were abandoned sometimes by their own parents and grandparents 50 and 60 years earlier when people were fleeing for the exits. Now their own educated, white-collar grandchildren are recolonizing underpopulated neighborhoods.
Are we headed to a post-racial society that we all kind of dream and talk about when you're talking about the next generation coming back into that city center?
Americans are more than ever where they want to be. Journalist Jim Bishop wrote a wonderful book called The Big Sort, where he described this process where young couples that wanted to live in city centers moved there. Young families that wanted to get out of the cities where their families had been for 50, 80, 100 years got out. Everybody is, through the magic of money rather than melanin, where they want to be.
Ray Suarez from the PBS NewsHour, senior correspondent, thank you for your perspective, your insights. A pleasure talking with you, and thanks for being on Stay Tuned.
Great to be with you.
Our thanks to Ray. Jim Kircher and I were talking just before the show tonight that this was the topic that we think is perfect for Twitter, social media interaction, and what we have right now, which is our community table. I'll do introductions. John Paul, Sarah Thompson, Joe Wilson, and Barrett Taylor. All of you practically regulars on the show.
Like the Avengers.
Yeah, that's good. We need superhero uniforms for you. So you all have just been stripped away of any expert labels, and we have you here as citizens of the St. Louis region. I will open it up with a question, but based on how much you were all talking just now, you might.
No, Barrett was we were listening. So all I was saying is, I think institutionalized racism still exists. We still have a lot of issues in society, but the one thing I don't hear people talking about is what black people, what we don't do. We need to step our game up and think about the opportunities that we do have and not maybe talk about race and maybe work hard. And it's a hard thing to talk about.
What do you mean not talk about race?
Well, I mean, it seems like we have all these opportunities today. You can go to college, you can get jobs, you can do all these things, but we keep on talking about race. Race is an issue, but we have to work hard.
Why do you think that is, though? Why do you think people do talk that way?
Because it's easy. It's a fallback. It's a crutch. Why don't we move on? Why don't we, there's more we can do. Race is going to be an issue.
But I would throw it out there, how come you don't know that you aren't responding to a different tone of how we talk about race, which is, it's really difficult to stand up and defend. We were talking about this earlier. I said, I go out sometimes and I don't know if someone's treating me badly, if it's because I'm black, if it's because my husband's white, or they just are having a bad day.
Or they don't like your curly hair.
Right, or they don't like my hair. But here's the thing, you don't know, and you're almost not ashamed, but you find it challenging to bring up racist arguments. And so I'm just throwing it back at you. How do you not know that the ability to focus and say within our community we've got to do this, and stop making excuses for ourselves isn't necessarily in response to you don't want to be the only one standing out there trumping that racism still exists? Because it's a hard place to be when you are saying that.
I think there's a different, also another angle is that I can't believe, I thought I was going to just completely agree with you, but there's one thing is that I believe that legacy has a major play in everything, our background. I can't escape my parents, I can't escape my background. I happen to be, I think I'm Asian. Maybe I don't sometimes, but it's one of those things that I was born in a family that had certain attitudes, that had a certain background, had a certain culture that helped me succeed. And I think that because of legacy of whatever background you come from, it also hinders you. So maybe it's not just that. I've had friends that.
I think he's got a point. If you grow up in a community where the most you can aspire to is something still small within your neighborhood, and you're not going to be bringing in a lot of money. If you don't see people like you being a success in the world, it becomes much more difficult for you to imagine yourself being a success later on in life. So the more you see the people around you, this is about as high as you can get in the world. You stop looking for things beyond
At that first table, I love the quote of a lot of people are born on third base and think they hit a triple. That's kind of what came to my mind in that first table. Are you guilty of that very same thing in what you're saying right here?
What do you mean?
That perhaps racism isn't the same factor in your life that it might be for someone else.
Or let me reframe the question, is that
Please.
if I can do a better job.
Please, thank you.
Basically, just kidding, JC. That you came from parents that had a culture that they had in your home that helped you succeed.
My parents were first-time college graduates. Both my grandma and my grandfather were both born in Mississippi, sharecroppers, had no college education. My grandma and my grandma on my father's side had no college education. But the thing they did instill in my parents is that through hard work you can get things. Both parents went to Washington University, and they instilled those same things in me, that you work hard for what you get. With Asians, I know quite a few Asian people who come over here, don't speak any English, they work hard, work several jobs, and they work until they get something. Black people, we do have a strong history of working hard and achieving things. We still can pick those things up and still can achieve today. We have to realize it's going to be a challenge.
But I think that what we're saying is that your family did have that culture.
We lived in, it was not always there.
But
there's other families that don't have that at all.
Yes.
So how do we build that up?
That's a great question. I don't know.
Because we know race is going to be there. We know it's going to be an issue.
I would ask, I think it'd be great I would love to talk to your parents about that. Like, how did they become, my father never graduated from junior high. My mother was educated, but so I'd kind of both sides. But both of them were driven and hardworking. And so I did have that. I like to find out from your parents, like, how did they achieve that and get beyond that?
Well, I also want to just kind of bring it back to where we started off with Mr. Percy Green, who's here, and we talk about the Jefferson Bank demonstrations, which we're asking for 4 jobs for African Americans. And the whole premise behind that was so African American men and women, but men, can work and provide an honest living for their families, right? We are where we are today. Now, I ask you the same question, which is, what are the job situations today? When people look at crime, look at this, want to point all these fingers, have we made that progress? So yes, there are African Americans working throughout St. Louis, but if you scratch beneath the surface, not that much has changed. And I think that kind of brings it back to 50 years later. Yes, there are black tellers. Yes,
we famously had the BBC doing a story about how we have a racial divide along Delmar in our city.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think for me it gets down to when we try to tie it back to 1963, 2013. I think for me it's saying, like, can people, regardless of race, still have an equal opportunity to provide for their families? And I think if we focused on those questions, we all have our different experiences, we come up with particularly an answer of yes or no.
I don't like that question though, because I don't know how to define equality.
Going back to the Jefferson Bank thing, I think we settle for too much. We can get jobs as a teller, but we don't own the banks.
Well, that was part of it too, though. It was, beyond that.
That's where the
specific
money's at. There's no money in being a teller. The money's in owning the bank.
But in 1963, the idea.
I'm talking about today.
Yeah, today, no, but.
He talked about tokenism. When we go in there, we can get our money exchanged from a black teller, but we need to be owning the banks in black
Absolutely.
communities.
And are we?
No.
So then we get back to the question, does racism still exist today and in what forms? And when we look at jobs, you're sitting there quietly over there. But
It's okay.
Do you think a black person can own a bank?
I think
today, meaning that.
I think yes, of course. I think we have the ability to do it.
Okay. Meaning that I'm sorry, I should
In the
rephrase it.
environment.
The environment, the opportunity to actually do
We
it.
do have black entrepreneurs who do many different things in St. Louis and across the country.
Yeah, I'm just asking.
No, sure. Yeah.
Okay, hang on. Let's go. Let's hear from more of the similar conversation in an edited form that goes by much more succinctly from the young St. Louisans. Let's go back to them for a
live
second.
in Glendale. It's right in between Webster and Kirkwood, and I have probably seen about 3 African American families that live in the whole neighborhood.
White people know they're white when they're in a crowd of black people. Black people will always know that they're black.
Coming from Belleville, I didn't really, if I would have just been raised in Belleville, I probably wouldn't have seen other races hang out with other races all the time. I wasn't black enough because I didn't wear FUBU. I wasn't black enough because I didn't wear baby fat. And I was constantly having to prove to people who I was. And so that's what I feel like St. Louis is super, super ignorant on that, in that aspect of they really want to know what you are because they are confused and it's frustrating them.
A lot of people judge me. They were like, why do you talk like that? Why are you reading right now? Why are you not hanging out with us? Why is your hair so straight? Can I touch your hair? I feel like I got it from white people and black people. It was just I never knew where to fit in.
I just have a slight bone to pick to the fact that Hispanic is used as a race. Census or forms and applying for college and stuff. Are you black, white? Okay, no. Hispanic, I'm like, yes, I speak Spanish, but my mom's white. So, wait. What?
My grandfather is white, my grandmother is black, and that made a mixed father, and I have a black mother. So what am I? Am I just black?
I personally believe that the United States as a government, as a nation, needs to put in a little more work into using better words or using the words correctly.
We're going to try to talk about solutions here on this topic. Let me introduce our final table here, starting with John Wright, an author and historian. Thank you for being here. Also moving left to right, right to left, Rena Hajat Carroll with Diversity Awareness Partnership, Mark Albrecht, Project Engage Network, and Reverend Starsky Wilson, St. John United Church of Christ, and also with the Deaconess Foundation. Talking in light of solutions and also in light of what Ed just handed me, a piece of high-tech technology of what Twitter is saying. Education, we really have kind of not touched on education at all. Can I throw education out there in light of solutions when I say education in the St. Louis region as it pertains to race?
I would say education of people, because racism is a business. People make money off of it.
As we heard in Mr. Green's interview.
That's right. And unless people know their pawns in the game, they won't change. I think you've got to show where they are being taken advantage of, both black and whites. I think once people know how things are played and the education problems they're having, with education themselves, they won't change.
Tell us what you mean by that. What are you talking about, the business and being a pawn in this?
Let me give you an example. Realtors make money off of scaring white people. What they do, they chase whites out of neighborhoods, blacks are coming. We'll give you more for this, less for this house than it's worth because you need to get out of here. They sell it for a higher price to blacks. They make money by selling another house to whites. They've got 3 deals in that. All because whites were fearful.
You have historian on your title. Are you talking about today or?
Today. Yeah. It's happening today.
If we could make some application of history to today, the church that I serve is there in the Fairground Park neighborhood. When some of the studies were done after the riot with the integration of the swimming pool at Fairground Park, one of the part of the blame was placed on the public school system, suggesting that that the school system did not effectively prepare the population, particularly those students, for integration. I say that to say we're visited with a unique opportunity today as it relates to our school systems, that if we think about solutions, that how we manage, how we fund, and how we engage public education provides us with an opportunity to not only prepare a community for effective racial engagement and diversity, but it also allows us to address the economic impacts of the disparate the kind of disparate outcomes as it relates to race. Students who get the best educations, we know, have the opportunity to have greater economic stability in the future. We also know that when you're able to isolate poor students, African American students, students of color in one community, and keep resources away from them, then you keep them in a cycle of poverty. So part of our solution has to do with education, how we address this system, and the great challenge that we're faced with around some of our unaccredited school districts may very well provide us with an opportunity to get over this segregation of resources by geography and lines that are really arbitrary, if nothing else.
Not just in our schools, but if you want to talk generally, our neighborhoods, you can kind of say who lives where in St. Louis. What effect does that have, and why is that?
Well, and I think the other piece, just to follow up, Starsky, with your point about racial engagement in general, I think we need to be much more intentional in this city about what our civic and business leaders are saying about race and racism and how it impacts everything that Starsky just said. Right now, I'm not really very clear on what our leadership is saying about our school district issues. I didn't hear much about the Missouri State Fair, what just happened, and I think we need to increase the engagement in general of our leadership, because if we're not making it relevant to them, then how can we say this is relevant for the community at large? It's really just relevant for the people sitting around this table, and that's not going to yield any effective solution.
And to be a little more pointed, not to allow our elected officials to play divide and conquer politics in the city of St. Louis or in the wider region. We see this playing out in North versus South, in not only the city, but also increasingly in county elections. We see this playing out in the geographic distinctions in our state legislature when we're talking about the Missouri side of the river, that unfortunately people mobilize and stoke certain politics in order to get the best outcomes for themselves. To kind of echo part of what Mr. Green suggested earlier, we have to get to the point where those kind of racial politics are also a liability, not only in business, but also for our elected officials in our community.
And the question I would ask is, what is the value proposition for understanding structural racism in this city? I think it's that clear. And we have not had that conversation. We haven't had that conversation openly and honestly, and we need to start.
So let's talk about curriculum, racism and curriculum as far as that goes. It wasn't until I was in my 30s, I'm 42 now, that I learned who Percy Green was, okay? So there's something wrong with that, okay? I've lived in St. Louis almost my entire life, sans 2 years, okay? It wasn't until my African American history course that I did try to do a report on Percy. I'd heard about him, and then I wanted to find out more about him. I tried to do a report on local civil rights stuff. You know, this is still in the age of the internet, mind you. I thought I was just going to go into Google and type in Percy Green, St. Louis civil rights, and I was going to get 342,719 results back, just like I can get when I type in peppermint chewing gum stuck in the bottom of my shoe, okay? That didn't happen. What I found ahead of me was a very difficult task of trying to go to libraries because the internet was not turning much up. And I found that there are 3 basic hotbeds of civil rights history as far as libraries goes in St. Louis. The Thomas Jefferson Library at UMSL, the Missouri History Museum's library, and also the Julia Davis Branch Public Library. Okay, when I got to the Missouri History Museum's library, one of the places that I was pointed was to these bound books that were actually nothing more than newspaper copies of civil rights history, things that had happened from all different newspapers around the city around civil rights. Okay, these had not been scanned in. All right, remember, we're in the internet age here. Okay, scanners have been around longer than the internet has.
Not all of us, but
right. But so, you know, that is part of the problem. So often we look at civil rights from a perspective of national, sometimes global. But what about the rich civil rights history that's happened here? And with Project Engage Network, that's one of the challenges I want to put to St. Louis students. You try and do that report that I did as a college student in my 30s, and let's see how easy it is for you a couple of years later.
We have about 20 seconds. I want to give you the last word and ask you if you're optimistic looking at the next 50 years.
Oh, yes. Many of the problem seekers will be dead. And so that's very optimistic. But if I remember something that W. Du Bois said, in time, everything works out. Time can sometimes be long. I think we always have to keep that in mind. It may be long, but in the end, it will work out.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for your time. Thanks to everyone who was on the show. Stick around. We have the post show online. And thanks on behalf of Ed Reggie. Stay tuned.
Raise your hand if you've ever either witnessed or experienced discrimination.
Really, like one time I was in Iowa when I was really little, I was at a nursing home. This lady, me and my dad were sitting behind her, and she said that she didn't want to sit there because she didn't want to sit next to any.
Like when I went somewhere with my grandpa, and like people that were working in the hotel were looking at us strange. Like, why is this little black girl with this old elderly white man who's British? And I was like, Grandpa, like, what's going on? Like, why are they staring at us?
I actually just thought about a time like when I was younger and I was in Walgreens with my mom. I could see this security guard following me around the store. And she's like, Kristen, I mean, it's not like, you know, this is gonna happen all the time, but it's just like, you're black, like, you know, and he might think that little black kids steal all the time.
You know, certain negative stereotypes do come from realities and unfortunate negative realities that happen within certain social or, you know, local areas. But even still, that's not the definite situation for everyone.
Sorry, I was trying to do the Twitter at the same time. Yeah, please, go ahead. This is the question I want to ask that I started to ask the first table, and you said I should have, and then the third table said they didn't like it, so we'll see where that goes. But we kind of had a discussion of, not an expert, this is my term, but kind of like an active racism. We were kind of describing different acts of race. And I asked if there was, I'm asking now, is there a kind of a passive racism in saying it's very popular, it seems to say, I'm colorblind.
Yeah.
I didn't even notice. I don't even know. That's not an issue I deal with because I don't think like that.
Yes.
If I said that, what would you say?
I would say, see me. It's okay to see that I'm black and to see that I'm a female and to see those parts of me. And I think we make the mistake that when we see race, that it automatically is a bad thing. And so Dr. King, people often say the color blindness comes from his speech. He didn't say don't see the color of someone's skin. He said don't judge them based on that. So color blindness, I think, allows us to do things like to erase the history. Oh, we don't see race, so then what's the problem? Oh, you could live wherever you want. Well, not really. Not 30 years ago, even in St. Louis, there were restrictive covenants. So I wanted to also pick up to just, while I have this mic, the whole idea that stereotypes always come from somewhere. Oftentimes they were created to create narratives about groups of people. And so I think we have to be really careful when we talk about race to not take the deficit model, to not say, oh, these poor people who don't have this and that, or like I wanted to respond to the comment about, well, if you don't have parents that do a certain thing, or that you could get up and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but that sort of narrative about black people, it was about Chinese people for a while, it was about Irish for a while, that can happen, and it's not because it's true, it's because it's used as a way to shape the narrative about a group. And I will drop the mic.
No.
One thing I remember Dick Gregory saying at one time, why are blacks so angry? And people need to understand, until the system affects us both the same way, we're going to be angry. If I go in the store and you go in the store and I'm the only one followed, you don't say anything about it, you can be sure I'm going to be angry. But if both of us go in the store and both of us are followed, there's a different attitude, there's a different relationship. But until we both are affected and impacted by the system in the same manner, and you understand that, we're going to have problems. And that's one way to get people to understand where we are. The system doesn't impact you the way it impacts me. Until it impacts both of us the same way, we're going to have problems.
Yeah, and I think we have to throw in the term white privilege here. So that is something that used to be really highly skirted. Oh, you can't say that anywhere. I'm very grateful now that it's being introduced more and more often because, people with my skin color have to understand what those differences feel like. We're never going to feel them exactly the same way you would. But they're very real and they have an impact. And so I don't get impacted in the same way that you get impacted because you get impacted over and over and over and over again. I get to skirt a lot of those.
One of the I shouldn't say kids, one of the young people that we had in the studio, I believe, said, let me see if I can remember exactly how she said it, but you don't think about the fact that you're white. I think about the fact that I'm black. Is that true?
I think so.
We'll try the other one. Yeah, you're right. You couldn't quite hear you.
I think so, and I think it's because we have a situation in this country even today where people have to do the math, they have to do the calculus to determine how to best position themselves so that they have an opportunity and a chance. And so most people of color spend some amount of time trying to figure out exactly how should I dress, what should my hair look like, what should my clothing look, how should I speak, where should I live, what schools are optimal for me to attend in order to be acceptable. And when you're white, you really don't have to, if you just do the basics, generally you're going to be accepted and acceptable. You could make a choice to go to an HBCU and people would say you were brave and what a wonderful thing that was. An African American makes the choice to go to an HBCU and people say, oh, they couldn't cut it at a major white institution. So the realities are just different, and you have to think about those things. You never have the opportunity to just be and be who you are. You're always trying to dress it so that you fit.
That's privilege. That's privilege in itself.
What?
The ability.
Grab the mic.
I think that speaks to, white privilege. What's the guy who walks around, he goes around and does seminars on white privilege.
Tim Wise.
Yeah, Tim Wise. And he talks about it, he does not have, his demographic does not have to adapt to us because they they control, essentially, white people control society. Unfortunately, we have to learn how to adapt it to their society or else we're not going to be, we have issues. You talked about the piece of, the double standard. I can't walk in the neighborhood with the hoodie on and some Skittles and feel safe.
But can you come to, I'm thinking about when I show up in a meeting for this show during the middle of the week, and because I have a night job, I roll in jeans and a t-shirt and everyone else is here in a tie. Would you do that?
Wholly unacceptable for me. I come, I serve in a space where I get looked at in an interesting way for overdressing, right? I sit in a space where I have to sit around tables with people who can wear during the summertime a polo shirt and flip-flops in a meeting, but dare I do that, I wasn't ready for the job. I wasn't ready for the gig. And unless someone honors that reality, so this idea of not seeing, right, of not seeing race. Well, if you don't see race, then you don't fully consider my humanity. And if you're an elected official, if you're someone who makes policy and you don't consider the disparate impact of that policy on specific racial groups, then you are actually harming by not considering it. By not seeing race as you think about policy, you're actually harming people who are people of color or people who are caught in certain neighborhoods or in the web of poverty. You have to think about these things because the best policy actually places supports in places for people who have to overcome these kinds of challenges. I use the quick example, really great example here locally of an initiative called St. Louis Graduates that is seeking to increase the degree attainment for the entire region. Right, so that the entire 50% of all adults in the region have post-secondary degrees by 2020. Mm-hmm. Well, how do they go about that? Well, they go about that by webbing together a bunch of influential policy people, but focusing their strategy on people who are minorities primarily, people of color, and low-income students, because you can't lift all boats unless you focus on those that have the greatest challenge. And so I think we have to consider these things not only personally, but more importantly, from a policy perspective. I get over if you talk to me crazy. What I won't get over if you set up a system to where my 3 young boys are going to be locked out of access to opportunity.
And that is not playing the race card. And that's one of the things I wanted to just put out there is that, if you acknowledge these systemic issues, that's not playing the race card. That's naming the reality that is happening in our society. And I think we have to be willing to see that and be grown enough to have the conversation and have the veil of PC or whatever you want to call it lifted and look at the reality of what's happening in our city.
And what I think challenges me the most is when we see leaders who will say, okay, well, I picked up the St. Louis American. I read it. I'm good. I went to the Gateway Classic dinner. I hung out with my black friends. That is not enough. And the conversation needs to elevate. And that's where I see the biggest challenge in the white folks in our community is that they're not understanding how much depth this issue really has. It's not enough what's going on right now.
Tavis Smiley is one of Obama's biggest critics. Mm-hmm. Do you think Obama has done enough in the 2 terms he's been to address the issue on race? It seems like he's always skirting it when he talks about it.
Tavis Smiley is just mad because he couldn't get invited in. We just have to talk just lay it on the line. He and Cornel West. If he had asked him for advice, it'd been okay. That's the only problem they have right now.
But as Obama, we have a black president.
He's president for the United States.
But so my question is, where was that question for Bill Clinton, who got credit for hanging out with black folk, going on Arsenio Hall and playing the saxophone? Let's be clear. We need to ask policy questions. Mm-hmm. So when we assess the disparate impact of the COPS program and things that were happening in the Clinton era, that put more African Americans in jail because of him trying to look tough on crime and carrying out policies that took Reagan era, Bush era policies to a whole nother level. We didn't ask how much he's doing for black people. So I'm just suggesting that black people get off of that conversation because it's not helpful, it's actually harmful, and we push.
It's a completely individual, it individualizes racism rather than looking at the larger structure.
Systems.
I want to go back to something. I want to go back to what Rena said because I think it's an important point. There is research that is suggesting that if we let people take this easy road out, I read The American, I was with some black people, I have black friends, that it becomes the basis by which they rationalize behavior that is actually biased and policies that they can implement and support that are in fact discriminatory. We cannot give people the space so that they can rationalize their behavior on the basis of a few personal actions that they take that do very little to address the issue.
Can I change it just a little bit because I want to get back to Twitter. Something Ed brought up to me earlier was the notion of class, and I just want to read a tweet here from MK Stallings. White privilege is real, but not all white people are equally privileged. Immigrant heritage, social class matters. Is there an issue of class that we're not talking about here too that goes beyond race?
I think we all are multiple identities. It's and. I can't separate the part of me that's Kira, who's black, who's African, who's a woman, who's a professor, right? You can't take those pieces out. And so in our field, we call it intersectionality, right? There are intersecting ways in which my identity influences who I am. So change any part of that, and I have a different experience. So yes, class is important. Yes, nationality is important, and all those other identities. So to focus in and talk about race does not mean that those things don't matter at all. It's important to think about race in our city because it's such a prominent issue.
I know you want to jump in. We only have like 90 seconds or less on the live stream, and I want to bring up one other thing coming from Twitter, and that is that we didn't really talk about tonight that we thought we would talk a lot about, and that is that Del Mar divide that got that internet shared piece all over the world, and a lot of people thought it was inaccurate. But I just want to throw that out there, and your thoughts. 90 seconds.
It's absolutely true. I teach human diversity and social justice class at Washington University. My first assignment that I make my students do is go to the Schnucks on Lindell and the Schnucks on Clayton Road. They are to write a 2-page report about the differences that they see at those grocery stores. And it is amazing. I mean, it is everything from the size of the parking lot, security guard, produce, calorie count, calorie descriptions. I mean, everything is absolutely different, and that is this Del Mar divide conversation.
Place matters as much as race matters. And particularly in a community like ours with the fragmentation model of governance, then we see that where you live makes as much difference. But there's also significant overlap between those two. There's a reason why there's that Del Mar divide, and there's a reason why there's carriage houses on one side and tenements on the other side.
Yeah, but I want to make the point, and I've often made this point about the Del Mar divide. But those houses were built before black people lived in those neighborhoods. That divide existed a long time. There was a divide within the Jewish community north of Del Mar and south of Del Mar. Now that doesn't discount the fact that it still exists, but I wonder if that divide is part of a normal part of a city. We see it racially now, but again, those buildings were built before black people were living there.
I'd like to add one thing.
Yeah, go ahead. You got your mic on.
My realtor told us we moved in the south side of Del Mar. He said the police, he had home on the south side. The police department met with the community people, said, don't worry, we answer when you call. We don't do like we do on the other side. Wow. That was from the police department.
I just want to add.
Yeah, go ahead. Last word.
Simply that when I moved to St. Louis, my wife and I were looking for a house, and my wife is African American, and our realtor driving us looking for homes had no problem, no reservation about telling us we wouldn't want to look north of Del Mar because it's dark up there. And there was no reservation whatsoever with my wife in the car. It's so ingrained, it didn't even register to them what they were saying. It was just, don't look, you guys don't want to look at houses north of Del Mar. So it's an astonishing thing how ingrained it is in this region.
And I think it would be a mistake to forget.
Grab the mic. Last word.
Race is a part of the creation of a narrative that that divides people of similar social class backgrounds, and it allows policies to persist that privilege a very, very, and increasingly small portion of our population.
As American as apple pie, but Barrett says. I think we may have to do another show on this. I don't think.